So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear honorable guests, I'm so pleased to welcome everyone to the discussion panel of our International Scientific and Practical Conference, City as a Classroom 2020. So it's high time we started the conference panel dedicated to symbolism, mysticism, visual sociology of the European continent, sociological, psychological, anthropological, and religious perspectives on cities in other continents. That's the topic for the discussion today. I am Irina, Lopatiuk, and I should say it's a great honor for me to be your moderator on this discussion panel. So please allow me to introduce our dear speakers right in the order they are given the floor. So, Dr. Felipe Fernández-Armesto, who is an award-winning historian and the author of several best-selling books, including 1492 Ideas That Changed the World and the Americas. He lived in Indiana and is a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He has written numerous books on a variety of subjects from American history to the Spanish Armada. His works appeared and were reviewed by leading world publications. One of the recent works, as the Oxford Illustrated History of the World, is edited by him. So welcome. Our next speaker is Dr. J Nas, who is an author, emeritus professor of cultural anthropology at Leiden University of Netherlands. He used to work at the Institutes of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology, and Languages and Cultures of Southeast Asia and Oceania. He has published extensively in the fields of urban anthropology, development sociology, and urban symbolism, among which are Hypercity, Symbolic Site of Urbanism, Cities Full of Symbols, A Theory of Urban Space and Culture, Town Talk, The Dynamics of Urban Anthropology, and Urban Symbolism. We are pleased to greet you. Our next speaker is Dr. Oleg Maltsev, who is an author, criminologist, psychologist, photographer, investigative journalist. He is an academician of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, founder and director of the Memory Institute, head of the Expeditionary Corps. He is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. He has been conducting field research with the Expeditionary Corps in many countries for more than 6 years to explore on what levels and how people are shaped by cities. He is an editor of several interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Professor Malzah. Our next speaker is Ludmila Philippovich, Doctor of Philosophy, religious scholar, professor, the head of the Department of Philosophy and History of Religion in Institute of Philosophy by Skovoroda, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, professor of National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, vice president of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies, executive director of the Center for Religious Information and Freedom of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies. We are pleased to greet you. Our next speaker is a Professor Maxim Lepskiy, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor, Chair of the Department of Sociology and Administration of Zaporizhia National University, the Head of Research Board in Social Forecasting Sociological Association of Ukraine, Academician of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Greetings. Our next speaker and honorable guest is Charles Landry, who is an expert in the use of imagination and creativity in urban change. He is a fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. He invented the concept of the creative city in the late 1980s. The notion has become a global movement and changed the way cities thought about their capabilities and resources. He is best known for the Creative City, a toolkit for urban innovators. We are pleased to see you. And our next speaker, so-called the last but not the least, Professor Vitali Lunov, who is an associate professor in the university named after Bogomolets, the member of the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Clinical Psychology, World Federation for Mental Health, and the European Academy of Natural Sciences, Hanover, Germany. So I'm pleased to welcome all of you, and before we start the discussion, let me please add just a few words regarding the reference terms of this panel. So each speaker has the opportunity to answer 2 questions formulated and presented to you in advance, and I'm kindly asking you, please limit the extent of your answers up to 7-8 minutes approximately. And to begin with, we shall start the discussion on the first issue, Then we have a round, and afterwards each expert will have the opportunity to express his views and concepts on the second issue. Just in case any of you will need some sort of break, for example, just to take a glass of coffee or a glass of water or just a coffee, you're free to do that. Just make sure that your microphone is off and you can take your break. Okay, so the first issue is all about symbolism, mysticism, and visual sociology. Okay, so the first question is, cities as a living memory of the continents and comparative analysis of cities of different civilizations from the perspective of the city as a classroom. So that's the first point, and by this moment, let me please give the floor to Dr. Felipe Fernández-Armesto.
Well, thank you very much, Irina. It was a great treat to be able to take part in this get-together and a great privilege to share the panel with my distinguished fellow panelists. I'm very grateful and full of admiration for all the people who've worked so hard to make this possible. And now I've already warned you that I'm only dealing with the second questions. I sent Kanike a list of definitions that I'm adopting. I don't want to bore people with those. I can share my screen with you and show them to you if you like, but I think they explain why I'm only dealing with the second question, because I'm kind of comprehending the first in the second. So you may want to defer my contribution until the second round. Or do you want me to go ahead now and anticipate the second question?
I get your point. Thank you so much. So by this moment, let me please give the floor to J Nas.
I'm so sorry?
By this moment, let me give the floor to our next speaker, Professor J Nas. Dear Peter, we don't hear you.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm very glad that I can participate in your conference. And I want to present, of course, my work on urban symbolism. In the first question, I think the symbolic side of cities, what I call the soul of cities, is a very important and clear point where we can compare cities in the whole world. And that's also what I have done. All cities in the world have a symbolic side. And this can be rudimentary, this can be very elaborate, as often in capital cities, or it can be in transition. It's not a static thing, of course, but it is something that is changing. When the city is changing, for example, from an industrial city in a tourist city, the symbolism of the city is also changing. I always start with the distinction between a sign and a symbol. A sign is a thing which refers to itself. For example, WC is a place to go if you want to go to the WC, but a symbol is always referring outside itself. If you see a statue from a king, it is the king, but it is also standing for the state, what the king has done, what the state has done. It's a part of the symbolic side of the state in that country. So sign and symbol have to be distinguished. And then I distinguish 4 types of symbolism. Discursive symbolism, for example, street names or poems about the city. Material, for example, statues or landmarks. Iconic, for example, a holy person which stands for the city, which, for example, is a pilgrimage city. And then behavioral. Behavioral is festivities, rituals, etc. And I have read some of the papers which were presented for this conference, and 2 important questions came up to me, which I had to place into urban symbolism. And the first one was COVID-19, the virus, the coronavirus. And I think that the impact of the coronavirus in society and then in the symbolic domain is very strong in behavioral symbolism, because now people cannot come together. So all those festivities of the symbolic side of the city are cancelled, or they are done on a 1 meter distance from each other. So, or with only a few people. So the interesting thing is that on the one hand, the behavioral symbolism is changed very much because of the coronavirus. And on the other hand, new symbols have, rituals have come into existence. For example, in Italy, they were singing to each other when they were in lockdown, singing to each other from the balcony in the streets. So that was also done in the Netherlands. And the grandchildren were going to the parents, to the grandparents, and then singing for the window, making drawings for them and presenting them without going in the neighborhood of the elderly people. So I think that coronavirus epidemic has influenced symbolic symbolism. And the second thing I want to stress is Black Lives Matter. In one of the papers, that it was said that, of course, there is sometimes a struggle about a statue. In the Netherlands, we have had that about some persons who were seen as colonialists or slave traders. And those statues had to be thrown away in some way. But that person in that paper says that the statues are art, and that art is an important thing, and that in a heterogeneous society, there should also be a certain heterogeneity of statues, of art. And so he thinks that the conflict, the social conflict, should not be taken to the statues and to art itself. I think myself that when people conflict in that way, they don't look at art, but they just want to do what they want. And the issue, the historic and contemporary the discrimination issue is so important that art doesn't play a role. But it was an important theme. And I also see that in museums, changes from the Black Lives Matter come up, because there's often black women who are painted, but they have no names. And they are looking now for names to put a name of the person the black person who has been painted, to put it there. And of course, they have to send back to African countries or Asian countries the art that has been conquered in the colonial period and taken away to Europe and to the Netherlands. And that is also one of the things that's happening. Also, of course, names of paintings are changed. So what I want to stress is that, in my opinion, urban symbolism is very important. It is very good theme to be explored in different cultures and to raise new concepts. But it's also interesting to put it in the framework of the new things that are happening, Black Lives Matters, COVID-19, and that relation can be very strong. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over the 10 minutes.
No, actually, you're fine. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. So our next dear speaker who is given the floor is Dr. Alec Malzah.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Я очень рад вас всех видеть.
I'm very happy to see everybody here on this panel.
Для меня большая честь выступать перед такой титулованной аудиторией.
It's an honor for me to present my speech among such distinguished academics.
Ну и отвечая на первый вопрос, надо сказать, что я думаю, что я достаточно компетентен для того, чтобы ответить на этот вопрос.
So when it comes to question number one, I do believe that I'm quite competent to be able to address this question.
И, в общем-то, это более чем 30-летняя работа в этом направлении.
So when it comes to this direction, I've been spending 30 years of my life.
Я как бы, в общем-то, построил свой ответ так, чтобы мой ответ на первый вопрос потом продолжил ответ на второй как бы вопрос.
And I have, while preparing for this panel, I have structured my thesis in the way that my first answer to the question, the second answer would be basically the continuation of the current one.
И, в общем-то, что я первое как бы мог бы констатировать, что за достаточно длительный период экспедиционной деятельности.
And the first thing that I have to point out that in the course of long-term expeditionary activity,
то есть я не из тех ученых, которые изучают что-то в кабинете.
I mean, this long-term was all about practical and field research because I'm not that academic that would research things in the office or in the cabinet. I do everything in practice.
Да, и я считаю, что это вообще очень опасно работать в кабинете.
And I believe that when you're working from your desk, it is quite dangerous.
Потому что вы можете стать последствиями заблуждений других людей.
For the reason that one may become the consequence of somebody's misbeliefs or somebody's misconceptions of this world.
Я вам приведу пример, который у меня очень часто случался в моих исследовательских процедурах.
I would like to give you an example that I saw a lot in my research activity.
То есть какой-то очень, как кажется, умный человек в своей научной работе написал какую-то очень интересную вещь.
Sometimes you stumble upon scientific works when a allegedly very smart scientist wrote his work.
Ты потом садишься в самолет, туда прилетаешь.
And then you take a ticket to the airplane and come to that place to visit him.
И выясняется, что там не только никогда этого не было, но никто никогда в жизни не слышал про такое, а библиотеки и архивы говорят, что подобного рода явления даже не могло здесь существовать.
And when you come there just to see everything with your own eyes, it turns out that it never existed. Nothing like that, I mean, did take place. And when you go into the archives and libraries, you can find no evidence to what you have just read.
То есть в моей практике такие вещи встречались неоднократно.
And I have confronted this kind of situations not once in the course of my activity.
Хотя в очень многих авторитетных источниках написано совершенно другое.
Even though, let me repeat that in many like reliable, considered to be reliable sources, I mean, completely different thing is written.
И поэтому академическая наука все больше и больше отдаляется от реальности.
So what I would like to express is that academic science, the mainstream one, it goes far and far away from factual state of affairs.
То есть инструмент, который был нужен цивилизациям для жизни, для построения цивилизаций, основной инструмент — это научные знания, сегодня превратились в некую такую форму, которую читают только сами ученые, а никого больше это не интересует.
So since we are given a great tool to build different civilizations, which is a scientific knowledge, however, this knowledge has, this tool is being kind of misused because only scientists read and deal with the certain works and not everybody else.
Вот. И Почему я все это говорю? Потому что я объездил практически весь земной шар.
And the reason why I can make statements as such is because I have traveled all over the globe.
Ну, наверное, я не был на островах, где живут комодские драконы только.
The only place probably where I didn't go is the islands where Komodian dragons reside.
Так вот, у меня огромная исследовательская библиотека. Она содержит и фотоматериалы, и видеоматериалы, и монографии, и архивные документы.
And so the library I have gathered in the course of the years is quite rich. It has a lot of evidence, different type of evidence, archives, treatises, documents, photography, video as well.
Так вот, если мы известный исторический период как бы с вами рассмотрим, не доисторический, а известный исторический период.
So if we are going to consider the known historic period, I'm not speaking about prehistoric period.
Я говорю только о том, что можно увидеть собственными глазами.
In other words, I would be speaking only about those things that everybody can observe today.
То история городов насчитывает два периода.
So coming from this, the history of cities around the world do have two periods.
Первый период – это когда мы видим три вида городов.
So the first period would involve three types of cities.
То есть это город-крепость.
So the first one would be like city/fortress.
Мы видим что-то в виде Вавилона или Иерусалима, то есть некий такой культовый центр, как бы другой тип городов.
The second type of the city, it resembles to Babylon or Jerusalem. So it's like a cult city.
Да. И третий вариант – это торговый город, да, который как бы, в общем-то, основан на базе рынка в центре, да, то есть сам рынок градообразующий, да.
And the third type of cities are trade cities. I mean, when you have different markets being central to that city, and they are things that shape it, the city.
Да. И это очень древние города.
And these are very ancient, very old cities, the three types of them.
Да. И мы даже не можем сказать, к какому времени они принадлежат.
It's even hard to exactly determine what would be the time they would, belong to.
Потому что сколько будет ученых, столько будет и мнений на эту тему.
Because, we would have as many opinions as many academics are in the world.
И вот как бы есть строгое вот разделение, мы видим, когда возникает вместо 3 видов городов 5 видов городов.
And in the course of time, we have a transformation when we see that 3 types of the cities become and turn into 5 types of different cities.
То есть почему пятерка меняет тройку, опять есть множество гипотез на эту тему.
And as for the why did this transformation happen, why we ended up having 5 cities instead of 3, there are a lot of hypotheses about this.
Но это города уже другой цивилизации.
But those 5 types of cities that have emerged are cities of a different civilization.
То есть, если первые 3 типа городов принадлежали одной цивилизации, то эти 5 типов уже принадлежат другой совершенно цивилизации.
So just to repeat in simple words, the cities that belong to the first period belong to a different civilization.
И они ярко отличаются от тех 3 видов городов, которые я говорил в начале.
And these 2 types, 2 periods have very different cities. They're different between each other.
Okay. И эти 5 видов выглядят так.
And here's how these 5 cities would look like.
Один тип городов – это города очень похожие на Венецию.
The first type of cities do resemble Venice a lot.
Нью-Йорк.
For instance, New York.
Санкт-Петербург.
Saint Petersburg.
Одесса.
Odessa.
И так далее.
And so on.
Второй тип городов очень похож на Флоренцию,
Second type of cities resemble a lot city like a Florence,
на Великий Новгород в имперской России,
to Veliki Novgorod, which existed during Imperial Russia,
Киев
Kiev city.
и так далее. Третий тип городов
Third types of cities
– это города-символы,
are cities that are symbols.
такие как Мюнхен,
For instance, Munich,
такие как Палермо
Palermo,
и так далее.
and others.
И появился пятый тип городов, такие как Хальдерберг,
And the fifth type of cities that did emerge would resemble cities like Heidelberg,
такие как Падуя,
Padua,
такие как Болонья,
Bologna.
то есть где университет является градообразующей системой.
So what is different about this type of cities is that the university is the main component that shapes the city.
То есть, по сути своей, университет образовал город.
In other words, university did form the city.
То есть, в основе города лежит университет.
And it is in its foundation.
Да, вот Модена в Италии такая же.
For instance, Modena in Italy would be also belonging to this
Это
category,
тоже Тоскана.
which is in Toscana.
Тоскана, да, окей. И почему три первых города сменились на 5 типов следующих городов, и никто не знает, есть только гипотезы на эту тему.
And the reason why this three first type of cities became, changed by 5 other cities, we do not have an answer to this.
И, как вы понимаете, они отличаются и символизмом, эти города, друг от друга.
And as you'd understand, these cities are different by its symbolic part.
И символической, смысловой нагрузкой отличаются друг от друга.
And by what the symbols mean.
И, в общем-то, воздействием психологическим на человека они отличаются кардинально.
And the cities also drastically different from each other by the psychological impact that they have on people.
То есть, если первые 3 типа городов
If the first 3 types of cities
имеют естественное воздействие на человека,
had a natural influence on people.
ну, представьте себе какой-то город, который расположен на высоте 2000 метров, да?
Just to give an example, let's imagine a city that would be located at the height of 2,000 meters.
Да, вы еще дойдите туда, 2000 метров, поднимитесь еще туда.
In the first place, you have to somehow reach that city.
То есть, пока вы будете подниматься, вы многое обдумаете.
While you are trying to reach that city, you will reconsider a lot of things.
То есть, это естественное воздействие.
And this is a quite natural impact. Doesn't belong on.
То есть, человек сам выбирает, будет на него что-то воздействовать или не будет.
So it's up to a person. He chooses whether something is going to impact him or not.
То есть вы можете подниматься, а можете туда не идти. Это ваше личное дело.
It's your business if you are going to go to that city or not.
Ну, то есть вы посмотрели наверх, 2000 метров надо подниматься, вы думаете про себя. На фотографиях посмотрю, зачем я туда пойду и не хочу дойти туда.
To put it simply, one person might just say, okay, I'll just look at the images of that city. I don't have to physically go there.
А другой человек скажет, нет, а я в любом случае туда дойду и посмотрю, что там.
But somebody else might say, no, I would like to see things with my own eyes, and I'm determined to go 2,000 meters to the up.
То есть, по сути, это воздействие, оно фактическое, то есть естественное воздействие. То есть тут выбор человека существует.
So when we say natural influence, psychological influence, it is all about the choice of a human being.
То есть, например, такие, как, торговые города древние, туда еще доехать надо. То есть, хотите вы туда ехать или не хотите?
Again, if we are speaking about the first period when there were trade cities, again, there was a question if one was willing to commute that long to a trade
И
city.
если это, например, не Германия, а что-то другое, то вам еще нужно как бы понять, что, ну, когда вы туда приедете, у вас могут быть обманутые ожидания по причине того, что кроме руин там ничего как бы не осталось, и они больше интересны археологам, чем религоведам, там, например, или психологам, там, и так далее и тому подобное. Поэтому вот это естественное воздействие древности, как бы, то есть хотите вы туда ехать, и с какой целью вы туда едете.
And also that psychological influence, it still even exists today. For instance, if we are speaking about old trade cities, if it is not in Germany, if it's somewhere else, one might be really disappointed because there is nothing left of that trade city except some ruins. So that type of the city might be interesting for archaeologists, for instance, but it would not be that interesting for religious scholars or anthropologist or somebody else.
А вот когда мы говорим о 5 типах городах, следующее, здесь человека никто не спрашивает, хочет он, чтобы на него воздействовали или не хочет.
And here is very, very important thing. When we are speaking about 5 types of the cities that emerge from the first period to the second, what's interesting about this is that nobody asks or nobody decides if they will impact you or not. They just influence us.
И когда он вот в эту 5 попадает, его сразу город начинает воспитывать на всех уровнях.
And so once you find yourself in the city as such, which would be one of the 5 categories, the city starts basically shaping and training you unconsciously on all levels of a human being.
От религиозно-символического уровня до антропологического уровня.
Starting from religious symbolic level or philosophical symbolic level until anthropological level.
То есть мы об этом говорили на первой панели.
We have spoken about these things on the first panel.
Да. И поэтому, соответственно, в зависимости, мы не имеем сегодня дел с первой тройкой вот этих городов, потому что они уже, ну, все эти города, они ушли в историю.
In the 21st century, we do not have to deal with the first 3 types of city because they are back in the history.
А вот с 5 вот этих вот городов, которые сменила ту тройку городов.
But those 5 types of cities that did emerge after those 3 ones.
Мы вот по сей день живем в этой второй цивилизации, где вот города выглядят вот так.
So, just to make things easier for understanding, if we title that second civilization, there where we live, I mean, we can see all these 5 types of the cities and anywhere. You can classify any city according to that.
И, безусловно, эти города на нас имеют влияние серьезное.
And they do influence us in a very drastic manner.
Спасибо огромное за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltsev. So by this, please let me please give the floor to Professor Ludmila Philippovich. So you're welcome.
Okay, hello, but I have 2 questions to Professor Maltsev. May I ask him, really, thank you very much. Your classification of the cities is very interesting for me, but I did not listen about the 4th type of the city. You calculate only the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th. What about the 4th type of this classification? And the next question I have about the criteria which you put on your classification. It is the influence on the person of all this cosmos, city cosmos. Before my paper, it is very interesting to listen your answer. Thank you very much.
И второй вопрос заключается в параметрах, которые вы вкладываете в то, ну, вы же говорите, что город влияет на людей, вот по каким параметрам. И для меня это будет крайне интересно для моей, как бы, paper работы.
Окей. Дайте звук.
Could you please turn on our microphone? Слышите, да, нас?
Окей. Я прошу прощения.
Excuse me.
Да, что я упустил один город.
I did miss one of the categories.
Да, есть такой тип маленький провинциальный как бы город. Маленький провинциальный город, и такие провинциальные маленькие города существуют и в Италии, и в Германии. Вы знаете, он такой игрушечный, как из сказки Андерсона. Вы в него как бы приезжаете, там, знаете, там 100 домов стоит, там 2 бара и так далее и тому подобное. Вот это маленький такой городок.
So to answer, there is one more types of the cities that was omitted from the list, and it's a tiny provincial cities that we can find anywhere, even in Italy, Germany, all over the world. So this is basically like almost like a fairy tale city, as if you are reading the Andersen's tale. So it would have several bars, a couple of hundred people living. This is it.
И чем меньше государства, тем эти города интереснее.
And the less the country itself is more compact and small, the more interesting the cities become.
Чем больше государства, тем эти города менее интересны.
And the larger the country itself, the less interesting would become this type of the cities, the fifth one that we have listed.
У русских есть такая поговорка в имперской России до 17-го года как бы была.
So in Imperial Russia, they had a proverb that was widely used before 17th century.
Что в таких городах от тоски умирают мухи.
They used to tell. So here's the verbatim translation of that proverb. In cities as such, even flies would die from boredom. Because they're bored.
Да, территория огромная.
And the territory is huge.
И эти города, они оторваны от жизни, оторваны от всего, и там живут люди, и вот они варятся, как, знаете, как борщ украинский, как бы в собственном соку, и ничего больше не видят, и ни с кем больше не общаются. И вот это вот, и все один день похож на другой день, да?
And those provincial cities, they are really like very isolated, and people are very detached from the outer world. So they are really, I mean, they have very routine life, very boring.
И так как Украина, она меньше, чем Россия, ну, по размеру.
And since Ukraine is much more smaller compared to Russia by its territory,
то украинские города, они интереснее, как бы, чем российские города глубинки. Причина, еще раз повторяю, что это близость расположения ко всем остальным системам как бы государства, ну, я имею в виду той территории, до которой оно расположено. То есть, если вам, извините, до большого города ехать там 100 километров, то, извините, вы можете это проделывать каждый день, хоть на работу туда ездить при сегодняшних автомобилях. А если это Россия, где там расстояния измеряются тысячами километров, то только на самолете на собственном, ну, летать, как бы, да. Поэтому там, если мы возьмем север, Сибирь там и так далее, там по сей день сохранились, ну, такие города, как бы, которые, как бы, где вот, ну, один день похож, ну, на другой, как бы, день. Хотим мы этого, как бы, не хотим. Я был на Туве, я был на севере, я был в Сибири, как бы, я был в Приморском крае, как бы, и так далее и тому подобное. Там, ну, жуткие, как бы, ну, вот эти дни, они тянутся, просто время застывшее, бесконечное, как бы, и так далее и тому подобное. Отвечаю на второй вопрос. Да, отвечаю на второй вопрос. Что я вкладываю в это все? Уважаемая госпожа Филиппович, позвольте я отвечу во втором вопросе на ваш вот этот вот вопрос, чтобы не задерживать конференцию. Как бы, да.
So in order not to make everybody wait, Dr. Maltsev made some comments that are related, I mean, very to this region. So it was just an example of provincial cities. And as for the second question of Professor Felipovich, would you mind if Dr. Maltsev would answer that question during the second round of questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Maltsev, for your so widely answer on my question. And first of all, I want to congratulate all participants, and I'd like to thank you, dear Professor Maltsev, for this opportunity to think about such interesting and very new for me topic, because we are all are the citizens, not villagers. So this topic is very, very, very necessary for us to integrate our life experience and to realize about our life. Previous reports, which I particularly listened to, are based on the speaker's own experience. And I am not only the academic scientist, as Irina told. I'm not from the ivory tower. I am very active in my life, and I try to visit different places and to be involved in different types of life. So I'm very happy that during my life I have possibility to visit many cities and many countries. And if we, based on the typology of civilization according to Huntington, I was in 6 out of 9 representative cities of the named civilization. Orthodox civilization, this is Russian cities and Ukrainian one, Bulgarian, Czech, Polish cities, Western civilization, Rome, Paris, Barcelona, Madrid, Berlin, Amsterdam, London, and many others. Even Islamic civilization, Istanbul, Hindi civilization, Delhi, Japanese civilization, Tokyo, and even Buddhist civilization, Taiwan. So I have my own experience, and I could share this experience with you. But I have the most complete idea of the city of Orthodox and Western Catholic Protestant civilization. It is the cities of these types that I consider mentally close to me, because it is genetically linked with this civilization. But due to my professional interesting, I was also interested in cities of other civilization. I don't know how appropriate such an analogy would be, but the cities of the Orthodox civilization, in my mind, are feminine, and the cities of the Catholic Protestant are masculine. And now I try to describe my idea about the feminization of Orthodox cities. According to this symbolism, Orthodox cities are settlements with this strong feminine energy and mysticism. All life in the cities of so-called Orthodox civilization is saturated with female symbols. It manifested itself especially vividly in architecture, painting, language, and religion. Thinking about the cities of the Orthodox civilization, the image of the Orthodox Church arises before our eyes, which is still in the still a very necessary component of the modern city. I do not explain and do not describe the typical Orthodox temple, because you have such imagined before your eyes and in your mind. But what I would like to stress, the cities of the Orthodox civilization as a rule are closed space, the main vocation of which, based on the feminism, is to protect, hide, preserve, and warm. As a rule, they hide in inaccessible areas, behind ramparts, water barriers, behind brick walls. The center of such cities is not a symbol of the secular power, the magistrate, for example, but a temple, a monastery, a symbol of spiritual power. The center of the Western cities is the princely palace, but the Orthodox one are the chambers of the Metropolitan or Patriarch. It is clear that Orthodox cities teach the priority of the spiritual over the material, the domination of the religious principle over the secular, the formation of the corresponding mentality of the people. The entire space of such a city is considered sacred, filled with a special higher meaning. This archetype still lives in our time. And I would like to remember the very interesting example. This was shown by the events of the celebration of the Independence Day of Ukraine on August 24th this year. The version of the holiday of the current government in the holy place Sophia Square, where the Cathedral of Saint Sophia stands, was not widely accepted by the Kievans and is actively criticized. The sacred symbols of Kiev have drawn in the song show of the popular Ukrainian songs of the last 29 years. Neither songs in Ukrainian nor favorite performance saved the situation. Kiev, as the main city of the Eastern Christian civilization, the mother of Rus, not Russian, but Rus cities, were not only for the Rusichi, not Russians, Rusichi, but also other peoples, other nations. For example, Assyrian diaspora, Armenian, Jewish, all believers are still strong here in Kiev. Nowadays, Muslims, Tatars, Azerbaijans, Palestinians, Pakistans, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and many other feel comfortable in Kiev. Kiev has become a mother for many nations and religions. In a word, an Orthodox city, as exemplified by Kiev, is still a place where learning takes place, where historical and modern culture, the culture of autochthones and migrants, youth culture and the culture of the older generation, mass culture and elite culture, religious and secular culture meet. And this meeting is not always peaceful, mutually enriching. There is only one way out: to live in a family-like way, giving everyone space for independent autonomous development. Feet get together to the common holidays, and Ukrainians love and know how to celebrate. So I see the only one way how to cooperate, how to live together. This is to combine the secular and religious, historical and modern type of living in a very, very modern city like Kiev. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your speech, Professor Felipovich. And by this, please let me give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepskiy. So you're welcome.
Добрый вечер, уважаемые коллеги. Спасибо за возможность поучаствовать в таком важном мероприятии, в этой дискуссии.
Good evening, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to be here with you and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion with you.
Мне очень интересно было выслушать своего коллегу Олега Викторовича Мальцева. В экспедиции приходилось регулярно оппонировать по некоторым вопросам.
It was very interesting to hear my colleague Dr. Maltsev, and I remember when we were in the expedition, I opined to Dr. Maltsev very often.
И, по-моему, эту концепцию Олег Викторович представил впервые.
And I think that this conception that we hear here from Dr. Maltsev was presented for the first time.
Я хотел бы ответить на первый вопрос нашей панели дискуссионной по поводу городов как памяти.
And I would like to answer the first question of this discussion about cities as memory.
В вопросах памяти мы наблюдали, что существует как сохранение языка символического памяти, так и забывание этого языка.
And when we talk about memory, we already saw that there is two different types of activity, as we can say so. It is preservation of the language, symbolic language, and this is forgetting of symbolic language.
И забывание было видно в нескольких формах.
And we saw the forgetting of symbolic language in several forms.
Одна из форм была реконструкция и реставрация.
One of these forms is reconstruction.
И когда мы видели, например, Пизу или ряд других городов, было видно, как идеи реставраторов были важнее, чем идеи, которые были первоначально в городе.
And for example, when we talk about such city as Pisa, we see that ideas of different restorers were more important than previous idea of this city.
Другая форма забывания – это уничтожение исторических памятников.
And the second type of this form of forgetting is destruction of historical monuments.
Это было как и в древнегреческом периоде, когда мы знаем, в храме Дельфи уничтожались статуи Фил, которые обозначали тот или иной участок Афин.
We already saw it from the ancient Greek period, for example, the Delphi, when statues were destroyed and everybody were forgetting this.
Как мы видели и во Флоренции, когда часть памятников были просто порублены топорами или мечами, как обратили мои коллеги на это внимание, но было очень трудно определить, откуда этот памятник.
And for example, when we were in Florence, in Italy, we saw like how monuments were chopped down with axes. And my colleagues, they actually put it to my attention because it's very interesting. They were chopped.
Помимо забывания, не менее важным процессом является раскодировка символики, которая представлена в тех городах, о которых говорил мой коллега и друг Олег Викторович.
And this is also very important when we talk about symbolism of the cities, is to decode this symbolism, as my colleague Dr. Maltsev said about the cities.
Здесь мы видели полную гиперреальность для туристов.
And this is actually the hyper reality for the tourists.
Например, мы приезжаем в какой-то замок, нам говорят, это замок для королевских персон.
For example, we come to one castle and people say to us that this is a castle for royal people.
Но внутренние предназначения помещений не предрасположены для такого уровня власти.
But when we see the inside forms of this castle, we understand that this castle is not for such power, for such people in power.
Невозможно там разместить ни свиту, ни прислугу, ни охрану. И нам навязывают повестку дня как туристам, чтобы мы просто потребляли этот продукт.
Because in such castles you cannot place retinue, servant, or security for royal people. But when you come to this castle, everybody's saying that this is a castle for royal people. So this is made for touristic people.
Второй момент, который был связан с раскодировкой символической, это когда спрашиваешь у туристов, что ты запомнил после посещения этого города или этого объекта.
Talking about the second issue about decoding of symbolism, there is a question. For example, you meet a person who was as a tourist in some place and you ask him, what do you remember for this visiting, for this, from this city where you have been?
Обычно отвечают там просто красиво.
And usually they answer, it was very beautiful.
И на этом заканчивается осознание того фактажа, который вроде бы был представлен в этом объекте.
And for them, for such people, they actually, this is the end of their perception of this object, of this city.
Это говорит еще и об уровне подготовки людей и об уровне проживания в своих городах в исторической среде.
And it is actually speak a lot about the level of training of such people and about their life in their cities.
Не менее интересным фактом является наложение в городе разных символических языков, разных периодов.
And there is another very interesting fact. In every city, you can see the different periods of symbolism that are combined together in one city.
И это определяет определенные контуры отношений внутри этих сообществ.
And this is what defines the relationships between different communities of this city.
Когда экспедиционный корпус приехал в Севилью, которая уже была в 30-е годы отформатирована американскими историками в определенных объектах.
And when Expeditionary Corps came to the Sevilla, which was already formatted by Americans in 30s,
первое, что мы увидели, это на стоянке двух типов, которые употребляли какой-то растительный наркотик.
And the first thing that we actually saw in this city, several guys who were sitting at the parking place and they used some kind of drugs.
И они криминально контролировали территорию въезда автомобилей и их сохранность.
And actually, they were the guys who controlled the entry to this city and all cars there.
Подобную ситуацию я увидел в Киеве на Поздняках.
And the resemble situation I saw even here in Ukraine, in Kiev, on Rezniki.
Это означает, что символизм криминального мира в определенных действиях очень похож.
And I can say from this situation that the symbolism of criminal world is very similar to each other in different parts of the world.
Но это уже современный символизм города.
But right now I'm talking about modern symbolism of the city.
Не менее интересным мне представляется в рамках вопроса поставленного момент фрактального распространения города, тиражирования подобных форм.
And there is another very interesting question when we talk about fractal spread of the city.
Поскольку пограничные города часто являются наложением разных фракталов.
Because when we speak about borderline cities, they are very often some kind of combination of fractals.
И тут возникает вопрос, когда замысел города был один, и он принадлежит другой цивилизации, а современные границы создали новое значение города.
And here we talk about very interesting situation because the idea of the city was different when the city was founded. But after we get new borders, and now we have old idea and new borders.
Это, пожалуй, те тезисы, которые я хотел представить на рассмотрение моим коллегам.
And these are my main thoughts about this question that I wanted to represent to my colleagues.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Lepskiy. Thank you for your speech. And right now, I'm honored to give the floor to Charles Landry. So you're welcome, please.
Hello.
Could you please turn on your microphone?
It is on. Someone turned it off. Anyway, pleased to be here. The way I'm going to respond relates to my work, which is basically working as an advisor to cities and working with them. And always the main idea is how they can generate energy, how they can become more of what they want to be, how they can catalyze potential and so on. So a lot of this is obviously about meaning and sense making and so on, which I'll talk about in the second session. But I suppose what we can all say, and we all know, there are so many types of cities, from the village to the town to the city to the mega city and so on. They all exist in different types of landscapes, from the mountains to the sea and so on. And there are so many different purposes of origins, which we all know, you know, the military encampment, the trading crossroads on a river, the port, the centers of learning, the place of a resource like a coal, steel, or being a manufacturing center or a religious center, or even more ever today, tourist destinations and so on. The main point really to consider is that all of this is changing dramatically now, that lots of these places, whatever their past is and whatever their culture is, they have to find a new role in the new configuration of a globalized world and so on. That globalized world will of course change under COVID, clearly. And one of the dangers is that we compare oranges with apples, and that's always a danger. So the main thing is, obviously we know that there are core things that always remain the same through time and place and cross-culturally. For example, the need to survive, shelter, and all of these things, and things that in cities give meaning to the people who are inside there, etc., etc. And also, what is the associative resonance that a city has, which is many of you have talked about. And associative resonance is obviously something, if I say the word Paris, I think of things. If I say Amsterdam, we think of other things. But anyway, that's another story. But each city, of course, has so many histories, its own histories of either being conquered or being a conqueror, and that shapes how it feels and identifies itself. I mean, if you just take Memphis, which had, in America, had a very interesting history, but then the death and the shooting of Martin Luther King completely changed the self-conception of that city itself. Then, as its strategic plan over the years, it also identified itself as a city of second chances, which is another way of saying we want to be a city that empowers people. So basically, city making is about storytelling, and there's always a deep culture, but people try to put stories either working with the deep culture or often working against it, because they obviously want to reinvent themselves. Now, when you put all of this together at a global level, what you can see is there's a global urban hierarchy, which gives functions for each city in that, in terms of particular networks, power structures, economic structures, and so on. And I don't want to go into detail, but you could probably outline about 8, 9 different levels of the hierarchy. You know, on the top are the key cities. There are probably 6 or 7 in the world, which are the centers where political, cultural, and economic decision-making is essentially driven. And New York is just one example of that. And then all of that is then being contested, of course. You know, there are places that are trying to rise, Shanghai, Beijing, and so on, and Dubai are all trying to find roles in this new world, and they are reflecting that through the way they're building that city and in terms of feel and so on. Unfortunately, most of these places are very soulless, but that's a different question. What they're essentially projecting or trying to project is ambition and power. The other thing that all of that does is, of course, shapes the mindscape of the actual individual, the organizations who attract it or work there, and the city itself. If you see a Dubai person now talking about themselves, they talk about themselves in a completely different way than they did 30 years ago. Now, all cities are obviously more or less diverse in one way or another. Obviously, you know, the cities on the mountaintops of Yemen are less diverse than ones at a port city, you know, like Marseille or something like that. But mostly cities are diverse and very diverse, as Ludmila, thanks for your point about feminine and male cities. Reminds me of Adelaide. Adelaide in Australia has got a woman's name as the city. And I did a big lot of work in Adelaide, and I always felt that they could work on their femaleness, which was a power in terms of where they might go. But anyway, we can see all of these things in any city we choose to take. I'm just going to take one or two or three. I mean, for example, if you look at Palermo, you can see the layers. Every city has layers that is more than 10, 20, 30, 100 years old. So the layers of Palermo are particularly interesting because you can see it in the architectural fabric, from the Norman, from the Arabic, from the Spanish, etc., to the Catholic dominance of the city. However, what is amazing about that city is they have merged the symbolism within the buildings themselves, rather like the Mezquita in Cordoba, where the Arab wonderfulness of that, the king of Spain felt it was so beautiful that he built the cathedral inside the Mezquita. That's very rare. This also happens in Palermo, where the Norman Arabic Catholic things you can see in one building and in the visual landscape of that. Now, clearly, that doesn't mean that the culture itself, which is dominantly Catholic, has absorbed all of this in its day-to-day activities. You can see some of it obviously in the food culture and so on. And then obviously the mafia culture, which was a response to all these invasions through time, has added another layer, which is really a negative layer. You could take another example, which is Penang in Malaysia, which is the most multicultural place in that region, which is a mix of Chinese, Indian, and Malay. And the clan houses of the Chinese themselves are all very different. And the Indian culture, which is mostly Southern Indian, is different from the Malay, but they don't mix, really. They coexist, but don't mix. But I mean, we could talk more about this, and I think I better leave it. We're running very much behind time, so I'm still on 7 minutes, so I'll leave it as that. Thank you. Basically, I'm just saying there's layering, and you obviously have to interpret it.
Thank you so much for your speech. Thank you. So by this moment, please let me give the floor to our next speaker, and the discussion concerning cities living memory and desiccation, different civilization in the perspective of the city of the classroom will continue Dr. Lunov. So Vitali Lunov, please, you're welcome to speak.
Добрый вечер, дорогие коллеги. Очень рад принять участие в сегодняшнем обсуждении и в самой конференции, которая, пожалуй, одна из немногих посвящена столь серьезной теме и теме достаточно актуальной. Большое спасибо.
Good evening, dear colleagues. I'm very glad to be here on this discussion and this conference, which is very important and talks about very important issues.
Если вернуться к конкретной формулировке первого вопроса, то вот в нем есть очень интересный лингвистический конструкт, такой психолингвистический конструкт. Город как память континентов. И я бы обратил внимание на концепт континента в данном случае.
If we talk about the first question of this panel, we see very interesting language construction, cities as a living memory of the continents. And first of all, I would like to pay your attention to the continents.
Собственно, главный вопрос в том, что помнят континенты. И главный вопрос в том, когда континенты появились. Мы сейчас не говорим о периодах создания нашей планеты и нечто похожем. Речь идет о том, что континенты появились в тот момент, когда их назвали.
And first of all, I would like to pay attention to the question, what continents remember and when they appeared actually. And I'm not talking about the creation of the planet, but actually all continents appeared at the moment when we named them.
А назвали мы их по ряду простых причин. Это военная экспансия, научные открытия в период великих географических открытий, так называемых. Это торговля, это религиозное порабощение. Вот это и есть создание континентов, как субъектов, так скажем. И вот с этого их памяти начинается.
And we have to pay attention to the moment when they were named. And we have different situation when they appeared. This is about military expansion, this is about scientific discovery, this is about trade, and this is about religious enslavement.
И очень важный момент в том, что тот, кто называет, тот и создает память или закладывает основу для этой памяти. Вот что и помнят города.
And this is the moment when living memory of continents began. And the man or the person who named this continent, he is the one who actually make the memory of this continent. And this is what continents remember.
Если мы подойдем к психоаналитической антропологии, то и вообще вот, собственно, к такому психологическому подходу к данной проблеме, то мы можем сказать, что больше всего помнится. Помнится больше всего то, что больше вытесняется.
And when we talk about psychoanalytic anthropology and psychological approach, we have to ask what people actually remember. And they remember something that was extruded.
А это уже отсылает нас к такому понятию, как травма. Травма, в которой встречаются и сочетаются вина и стыд. Вина завоевателей, вина экспансии, тех, кто поглощает, и чувство стыда тех, кого захватывают. Вот сочетание этих двух позиций и, собственно, закладывает основу очень многих цивилизаций, о которых мы говорим.
So actually, what people remember? They remember the things that was displayed. And here we talk about some kind of trauma. And here we have two words, shame and guilty. We see the shame of people who took over. And we see the guilty of people who made this expansion.
Вот почему это и вытесняется. Вот у живого обычного человека такое вытеснение происходит на уровне симптома, а у цивилизации или города это все сублимируется в какой-то аспект культуры, архитектуры, значимых мест, собственно, то, что и создает цивилизацию как таковую.
So talk about these displays when we talk about animalistic side, about animals, animal element, we talk about symptom. And when we talk about civilizations and cities, we talk about cultural aspect.
И поэтому здесь очень важна символика, потому что она позволяет вот этому вытесненному, тому, что вызывает у покоренных народов, условно говоря, стыд, а у тех, кто покоряет вину и необходимость вот эту всю империю удерживать и поддерживать каким-то образом, вот именно столкновение с символом, с чем-то символьным, утихомиривает происходящее, и жизнь продолжается дальше.
And here we talk about symbolism because this situation make symbolism very important element. And talking about displacing, the conquered people, they have a shame, and people who made this expansion, they have a guilt. And this collision of the shame and the guilt makes a new element, which is symbol.
Собственно, это основные позиции, дорогие коллеги, которые я хотел озвучить. Мы, города, всегда помнят вытесненное. На самом деле это так.
And this is the main thoughts that I want to represent to you, my colleagues. And I want to point it out once again. The things that were displaced, this is what people remember.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vitali Lunov, for your speech. So by this moment, let's continue our discussion. And we have the second round, we have the second part. We're going to speak about the following question. What is the difference among influential factors in learning and training in cities of different civilizations? So this is the question, and by this moment, I am honored to give the word to Dr. Felipe Fernández-Armesto. You're welcome to speak.
Well, thank you very much again, Irina. I've enjoyed it so far, and I've learned a lot. It makes me very sorry that I've not been able to attend any of the other sessions. It also makes me deeply penitent that the essay that I submitted in advance has turned out to be almost completely irrelevant to the session as formulated. But we are very, I think we are, Charles Andrew mentioned, we're running over time. And I guess one of the ways in which I can reframe my submitted essay to make it relevant is just very briefly, you know, to reformulate a bit. I noticed that you know, there hasn't been any discussion so far of the problem of defining the terms of the discussion, the terms of the questions that you've given us to answer. And I've produced my own definitions, which I'll just share with you if I can operate the technology sufficiently. So we've got this. This is my these are my definitions. In order to save time, I'll just show them to you. You can all see them, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, if you switch to share screen view. But I just draw your attention to a couple of things. I think I've opted for a very commonsensical definition of civilization and city. But by living memory, I've really chosen to focus on the explicitly message-bearing content of cities, not on that stratigraphy, that layering which Charles Landry described so well and which contributed so much to Peter Maas's and other contributions that we've heard today. And the reason why I'm only really going to talk about the second question is that I think it comprehends the first. So I'm pretty much going to read the rest of my my remarks, if I can find a way of yes. And because even with the very flexible starting points that I've just shown you, I'm not sure that civilizations are the best units of study for the sort of questions that this session has posed. And I guess, for example, that we all probably put Quattrocento Rome and Florence in the same civilization. But obviously Rome was much more coherent in terms of the way it was governed, clearly defined form of government than Florence had. And as a result, a great deal more ancient art was on public view in Rome, and the symbols on the facades and underfoot all acknowledge, you know, the SPQR, acknowledge also the patronage of the church. Whereas in Florence, you know, every street corner, you know, recalls for you what a riven city it was. And so really, you know, in some ways, I don't think civilizations are anything to compare. It's almost better to compare individual cities, or to find other units of comparison to which groups of cities fit, rather as Professor Maltsev did. Still, I mean, I think we can hazard a few more or less generalizable observations, and I hope I've got time for three. First of all, there are cultures in which cities are best understood as clusters which are often developed at random or in inconsistent ways around what urban historians used to call ceremonial centers, monumental zones erected typically by elites to express their values and conduct their rituals and celebrate their power. And some cities, I think, perhaps never cease to be of that kind until history consigns them to ruins. The obvious examples are in the most obvious, conspicuous examples are in the pre-European Americas, where I think it seems to have been a universally encountered pattern for cities to be like that. Nowadays, there are regimes which I guess many of us would call authoritarian in China, say, and Russia, where ruling groups are still striving to keep the unity and purity of the message projected by their monumental zones, their ensembles, their monuments. And on the other hand, this is my second category, there are cultures such as have predominated in the recent history of much of the world, especially in parts of what we loosely call the West, where cities have become places of potentially diverse, potentially and actually diverse cultural encounters. And obviously there are demographic and political reasons for that, and some speakers already alluded to some of these. And the result to me is more, in more ways, like Quattrocento, Florence, or some other pre-industrial, early industrial cities than it is like Rome, with different quarters or districts, ghettos formerly in some cities, foregrounding in their urban projects the histories of the communities or sectional interests that have come to dominate them. Or in typical cases, with city authorities, where overall authorities exist. Of course, most of the contributions we've had today so far have been really focused on what city authorities want to project as the character of the places they inhabit. But where authorities do exist, they typically, in the modern West at least, they tend happily to license a sort of melange of new monuments and styles of urbanization in the interests of pluralism. And that seems to me to be a good model because it reflects the truth, the way cities really are, and because it conduces to civic peace. Now I come to my third point, which is obviously, to some extent, J Nas was already kind enough to, I think, to refer to what I said about this in my previous essay. I think that pluralism, this sort of pluralism, is now facing a threat from what I'm inclined to call the tyranny of ignorance among factions or movements, sometimes mobs, who want to excise these Liudmyla, the ones that they dislike, typically on the grounds that the monuments and assemblages in question arouse their offense or indignation. I agree with Peter, I mean, I absolutely, this isn't to do with art, although I mean, art has a marginal role here. It's much more to do with whether you accept the political, cultural message that the monuments were designed to project. And I'm very surprised at the success of politically correct vandalism at the moment. I mean, it's astonishing to me. You can see statues of St. Junipero being toppled in California, where, you know, his contribution to the history of that state was almost entirely positive. Or, you know, you think of people like Sir Hans Sloane, being shut away in the British Museum. He founded it, you know, or Gladstone in Liverpool, or, and obviously the controversy over Cecil Rhodes in Oxford has been widely commented on. Peter Nas mentioned a Dutch example of this sort of thing. By privileging some people's indignation over others, rather than enhancing pluralism, by including all minorities' interests and self-perceptions in city planning and in statue erection, in my submission, we're endangering some of the most precious features of the city we inhabit, the cities we inhabit, and especially endangering their roles in educating citizens and visitors.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I was very much interested in the last speaker, what he was saying, and it fits my views. But the second question about the city as a classroom, I really feel that the city has always been my classroom and the classroom of my students. When they study urban symbolism, they come to me and they say, I'm going to that city, to Cape Town or Mexico or Amsterdam. What do I have to study? And then I say, I don't know. I don't know what you have to study, but what you have to do is you have to behave as a flaneur. Flaneur is a French word for a stroller, a person who goes in the city and walks around. And then in the first phase, of course, you have to stroll around and talk with everybody you can about the city, about what they think, about what they are doing. And you also have to visit all parts of the city to familiarize and to know when they talk about things, about places, about buildings, that you know them. So you have as many at random contacts with people in the hotel, with people of car drivers, and so on and so on. And then you try to combine what they tell you with what you already know of the city in literature, in papers, and so on. And then the flaneur, he is walking around, talking with everybody, taking it into his memory, but he is also a detective because he tries to combine it. And most people have a very partial knowledge about the city. They go from the home to their work and back, and they don't look around. And I have asked a person, is there somewhere a statue here? And then they say, no, here are no statues. But the statue was just around the corner. So they don't know their city. They only know it partially. And that's the interesting thing of the flaneur. He is a detective. He tries to get all those parts together and to combine it in one model, in one view. This is the view of the soul of the city. And I have given already 4 types of symbolism, and in most cities, all the 4 types are present, but some are dominant. And the people will tell you which one is dominant and so on. So the last part of what the students have to do when they try to appreciate the city is in some sort of an iterative process to try to combine all those data they get from the different parts the people see, and then to make a whole picture, and then to present this picture to the people again, which they have spoken, and often they use some key informants. And then you will see that they are very amazed. Often they are very amazed because they have never thought about their city as a whole. And that's also the difference between an anthropologist as a flaneur and a tourist. A tourist goes to a city and he looks at the Tower of Pisa, or he looks at a certain building, and he goes home and he says, well, that was an interesting building and so on. But he doesn't talk with the people. He doesn't combine the different views of the people. And so the student of anthropology, as a flaneur in the city, they have to go through this iterative process, a recurrent process, to combine all those data, and they also can use mental maps. Then you speak with a person and you give them a paper and you say, please make a map of the city. I have done this with several cities in Indonesia, such as Jakarta and so on. And then, of course, they say first, what do you want me to map, to draw? And then I say, you just draw, it's always good. Because in the first instance, they think, well, I have to make a very good map. But no, I say, just draw a map and then put in what you think is important. And when they have done that, you look at the map together and you say, why did you do this? Why did you put it there? And so on and so on. And later, you can put all those maps together, and then you will see that the number of things are clear for everybody. All people know that symbol. But other symbols are different for different people. And then you can see clusters of symbols that come forward. And then you can make a model of the whole city and, for example, of the layout of the city, but not in buildings or streets, but in symbols. And such a study, for example, I've made myself of Jakarta and other Indonesian cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, for your speech. And by this moment, please let me give the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Alec Malzah. Please, you're welcome.
Спасибо, что предоставили мне слово.
Thank you for giving me the word.
Сразу прокомментирую несколько тезисов профессора Felicpovich.
Just to comment several theses of Professor Felicpovich.
Отвечая на вопрос, почему София не стала центром, все очень просто.
To answer the question why Sophia didn't become the central part.
Дело в том, что чужие вещи, они никогда никого не объединяют.
The reason is that foreign things for a certain territory, they would never unite anybody.
Да, то есть если вы возьмете синагогу и приделаете к ней кресты, то и назовете это православным храмом, то вряд ли она перестанет быть синагогой.
For instance, if you take a synagogue and if you put Orthodox crosses on it, it won't stop being a synagogue.
И я думал, они хоть как-то скрывают это.
And I thought that they tried to disguise that in some way.
Но на самом деле никто, в общем-то, ничего не скрывает. И когда вы входите в Софию, вы с правой стороны сразу видите два макета, какая она была и какая она стала. Слева и справа.
And it turned out that nobody tries even to disguise it, because when you enter to Sophia building, you see two plans from on the left and on the right side. Basically the pictures before and after.
То есть, кому нужны фотографии, могу показать.
I can even show images.
Еще раз выложу в своем аккаунте в Facebook после панели.
I would share that in Facebook social media right after this panel.
Что касается исторической части, то, вы знаете, ложь никогда никого не объединяла.
As for the historical part, the deception, the lie never united people.
То есть ложь людей атомизирует.
Lie and deception, it atomizes people.
Разъединяет.
Puts them apart.
Да. И поэтому, прежде чем кого-то объединять, надо сначала сказать правду.
So before uniting somebody, one has to tell the truth.
Но как бы, если сказать историческую правду, то тогда может возникнуть огромное количество катаклизмов.
However, if the historical truth is conveyed to people, then there might be serious problems all over.
Да, и поэтому гуманисты говорят, что лучше вот жить как бы говорить правду, потому что иначе кто-то может пострадать.
So people that are for humanism, that are humane and positive, they think that it would be better to live in the lies and pretend that this is okay, instead of facing the harsh truth.
Нет. И перехожу как бы к самим городам, как учебной аудитории.
And so here I'm coming to answer the question of the cities as a classroom.
Я вам расскажу маленькую историю.
So I'd like to start from a very short story.
Мы работали в Италии.
Once we were working with Expeditionary Corps in Italy.
И пока мы работали, мы встречались с несколькими профессорами.
And while we were working, we met several professors.
И вот о встрече с 3 профессорами итальянскими я вам и хочу за очень короткий промежуток времени рассказать.
So in a couple of minutes, I would like to share about those meetings with 3 Italian professors.
Да. И мы как раз занимались этой проблематикой, и один из профессоров Болоньского университета
So we were looking into this problematics, and one of the professors from Bologna University
сказал такую фразу.
Said the following phrase.
Ну, говорит, ну, если вы жили в Неаполе, то, понятно, вы могли научиться чему угодно. Это большой порт, там огромное количество людей прибывает. То есть можно было получить самые разнообразные знания.
He said, if you have been living in Naples, then there is no hesitation that you have learned a lot of things, because this is a port city and there are a lot of opportunities to learn things.
А если вы жили где-нибудь в деревне, в Апулии, в каком-нибудь селе, то как бы, ну, что вы там, чему там могли научиться? Ну, только тому, чего там люди умеют.
And conversely, if you've been living in Apulia, in a small city, then...
Не Апулия, а small city, а где-нибудь в деревне возле Апулии.
If you have been living in a tiny village near Apulia, then you probably learned quite not many things. You're probably not that knowledgeable, allegedly, if you are living in the small city.
Да, то есть как бы, вот это сказал первый профессор.
So this was the opinion of first professor.
И в его словах есть рациональное зерно.
And in his words, there is something rational.
То есть вопрос, какой это город?
So it's always, the question is, what kind of city are we dealing with?
Да. Вторая история была в Калабрии, в Италии.
And the next story, the situation has happened in Reggio Calabria.
И я изучал клинковое оружие Калабрии.
So I've been investigating weapons of Calabria, edged weapons.
Да. И я спрашиваю профессора, это калабрийский нож?
And so I pulled out one edged weapon and asked professor, is this a Calabrian knife?
А он открывает Википедию.
And the first thing that he starts doing is he opens Wikipedia.
Да, ну я его спрашиваю, это же ваша тема, вы же этим вроде занимаетесь, зачем вам Википедия? Вы должны, посмотрели, сказать, да или нет, и все.
And I said, why would you use Wikipedia? This is your area of specialization. You can just tell yes or no.
Он все равно открывает Википедию.
But he didn't listen, and he was trying to surf Wikipedia.
Можно было бы сказать, что это просто некомпетентный профессор.
We could have said that the professor is not competent in this.
Нет, он очень уважаемый профессор университета, его там все знают, все любят, и студенты его любят. И у него огромное количество работ, очень уважаемый профессор.
However, no, I mean, publicly he is perceived as a very respected academic who is very knowledgeable in what he is doing.
Но просто Википедия это очень важно.
It's just for him personally, the source such as Wikipedia was very important.
Для него.
Yes, for him personally.
Да, а живет он в Калабрии.
But he himself resides in Calabria.
Вот видите, на него Калабрия как-то так влияет, что ему постоянно нужна Википедия.
So why I've been describing the situation just to show how Calabria influenced him in a way that he needs, for some reason, to use Wikipedia.
Да. А еще третья история, она выглядела так. Я в Палермо в свое время как бы встречался с одним профессором.
The third story is about my meeting in Palermo with one of the professors.
И это был такой вот аристократ.
And he was a noble type of man.
Очень уважаемый человек.
Very respected person in Italy.
Да, и ему не нужна была ни Википедия.
And he didn't have to use anything, no Wikipedia,
Ни его работы научные.
no scientific works of his.
Он вот сам был как ходячая энциклопедия этого города.
He himself was a living encyclopedia of that city.
Как мы видим, как бы разные города, они по-разному влияют на людей.
So these examples, they show, and not only this, there are a lot of examples that demonstrate us how different cities shape and influence people in different ways.
Если мы возьмем, например, города класса Венеция или саму Венецию,
Let's consider Venice.
то первое, что у вас возникнет, вы не сможете ездить на автомобиле по Венеции.
The first thing that you're confronted with is that you cannot drive a car in Venice for obvious
Вам
reasons.
придется ходить пешком
You will have to walk on your feet
или передвигаться на катере.
or use, ship type of things like that are driving on the water.
И даже когда вы доедете на катере, куда вам доедете туда, куда вам нужно, то в любом случае после этого вам придется идти пешком.
And even if you sail to the place you need to, after getting off that transportation, you have to walk on your feet.
Если вы посмотрите на Венецию, вы увидите, как говорят, это греческий низ и нормандский верх, как бы, да, то есть
So if we look
два
at
блока.
If you look at the Venice, as it is believed, it has two blocks. The upper part is Norman and the lower part is Greek.
То есть это два совершенно разных мировоззрения, соединенные в одно.
So two drastically different worldviews are combined into one.
То есть это как коктейль из двух слоев, который не смешивается между собой.
So that would be like, the Venice would be like a cocktail with two different layers and two different substances that do not mix among each other.
И каждый человек видит одну из трех Венеций.
Из двух, да?
С трех.
Из трех. And one person sees one out of three Venices.
Один видит греческую Венецию.
One person might see the Greek part of the Venice.
Другая видит нормандскую Венецию.
Another person will see the Norman side of the Venice.
Но настоящую Венецию видит только тот, кто видит этот коктейль вместе, в взаимодействии.
But the genuine Venice can be seen only by a person who can see the, factual state of affairs, that the Venice is a cocktail of two different substances, as we have said, Norman and Greek.
И как вы понимаете, на этих трех людей эта Венеция повлияет по-разному, в трех разных вариантах.
And correspondingly, this one Venice is going to shape different people in different ways according to the way they perceive the city.
И Венеция — это прекрасное место, которое нельзя изменить.
And the Venice by itself is a unique and outstanding place that cannot be modified by external factors.
И чем серьезнее город, с которым вы имеете дело, тем вы меньше изменений в нем видите современных.
The more serious, let's say, the city itself, the less you will see the modern modifications inside of it.
Попробуйте в Палермо что-то изменить в центре города.
Why doesn't one try to change something in the center of Palermo?
Вас посадят в тюрьму.
That person will be jailed right away.
Да. Попробуйте построить хоть одно современное здание.
Even if you even try to build at least one modern building in the center of the Palermo.
Попробуйте в Мюнхене в центре построить что-нибудь.
Or try to do same thing in the center of Munich.
Да, то есть вы увидите, что вам этого никто не позволит сделать.
It will be obvious that nobody is allowed to do those things in
Да,
the
они
centers.
к реставрации центра относятся очень, трепетно.
They are very careful about the restoration of these old buildings in the center.
Почему?
And why?
Потому что это та культура, которая формирует этот город, этот народ.
Because those central buildings, those central parts are that culture that shapes that nation, that shapes that city.
То есть это то, что их связывает с множеством поколений.
That is what combines and links people with previous generations.
Да, для человека очень важно, кто он.
Because for every human being, it is very important who he is.
И когда вы живете, например, в Нью-Йорке,
And for instance, if one is residing in New York,
где очень мало деревьев,
which has very small amount of green,
и который является отражением Венеции,
which is a reflection of Venice,
моделью Венеции,
let's say a model of Venice.
вы не видите в этом Венеции.
In New York, even though if it's a reflection of the city, you do not see Venice in New York.
Потому что вы там никто.
Because you are nobody in New York.
Если вы кроме камней ничего не видите, то у вас нет связи ни с чем. То есть это город, у которого нет прошлого.
Because if you are in the city and if you see nothing but a concrete, that means you are nobody because you do not have that link with the past, and the city itself have no past because it's only out of the concrete.
И, видимо, тот, кто строил этот город, так и хотел, чтобы люди, которые там находились, они чувствовали себя никем.
Presumably, people that were planning New York City did intend so that people would feel themselves as nobody.
Вот такой песчинкой по сравнению с этими зданиями.
Just a tiny drop of water in the huge ocean, I mean, on the background of huge skyscrapers.
Но это действует только, как вы понимаете, на самых обыкновенных людей.
But this would impact only very average people.
То есть, если замысел понятен, то он раскрыт, то это уже перестает иметь какое-либо воздействие, даже психологическое.
Certainly, one understands how the city was planned and why it is so. That person won't be affected by the city, even psychologically.
То есть, когда мы говорили на первой панели о воздействии города как бы на человека, на его как бы тренировку, приведу несколько примеров.
So when we're speaking about the impact of a city as a training program for a person, I would like to provide some examples here.
Вот, например, в Палермо на самом низком антропологическом уровне вас сделают очень внимательным. Хотите вы этого или нет?
For instance, in Palermo, even on the lowest level, which is anthropological, you are, I mean, this city forces you to become very attentive.
Если вы не будете внимательны, то вам обязательно выльют грязную воду со второго этажа или с третьего на голову.
If you're not attentive, somebody will definitely drop or pour a dirty bucket of water on your head.
То есть с вами обязательно что-нибудь интересное произойдет.
I mean, something messy and something quite interesting is going to happen to you in Palermo if you're not attentive.
И когда с вами это произойдет, вы станете немного внимательнее.
But once it happens to you, you are going to become quite attentive.
Потом с вами еще что-то произойдет, вы еще станете внимательнее.
Then something else will happen to you and you will become even more attentive.
И так далее. То есть к какому бы уровню мы ни поднимались, да, то есть как бы мы будем видеть, как Палермо превращает вас в некую личность, принадлежащую этому городу.
So it doesn't matter which level do we take, if it's a philosophical, anthropological, or neurophysiological. In any ways, Palermo shapes you as a personality that belongs to that place.
И когда вы начинаете этому сопротивляться, у вас начинаются серьезные неприятности.
And if you try to resist that environment, you will be in the trouble.
Ну а когда дойдет до религиозно-символического, философского уровня,
And if we go up to the level of religious/symbolic level of the city,
вы влюбитесь в этот город и никогда не захотите из него уезжать.
once you are on that level, and if you are looking the city through that prism, you will just fall in love with the city and you will never want to leave it.
И вот я видел, как у человека очень тяжело расцепить с Палермо, потому что он оттуда не хочет уезжать.
And I saw many cases when it's just so hard to take away Palermo from a person. He simply doesn't want to leave that city.
Поверьте, я видел города по всему миру.
And I've seen so many cities around the globe.
Но вот я думаю, что по красоте Палермо вряд ли кто-то, разве Венеция только может соперничать.
But I think Palermo is such a city when it comes to its beauty that maybe only Venice can be a rival by its beauty.
Ну, Сицилия и Венеция — это две крайние точки как бы Италии.
And Sicily and Venice are two extreme points of Italy.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Maltsev. And by this, the discussion will continue. Our next guest, Dr. and Professor Ludmila Philippovich.
Thank you very much. I will continue, and I would like to thank Professor Maltsev for his ideas, because I agree mostly of them. Especially your ideas about the dependence of the influence different cities to the person. Why do different cities teach? It is necessary to ask the inhabitants of those cities. And I could say why Kyiv teaches. And it depends, and we understand that there are people who teach nothing. And they live, for example, in the region of Tryeshina, and they never leave this Tryeshina, the special region in Kyiv, and they never see even the center of Kyiv. They did not know where is the Cathedral of Saint Sophia or government buildings and many others very historical and important places in Kyiv. There are people who study in segments of the city life. For example, only economic skills, or only studying skills, or only cultural skills, and so on. There are the people who, I would say, breathe the city with the full breath. They try to combine all this type of life and to involve the city to themselves. That is, it depends on who is studying, not just those who teach. And I could say only about my own experience, and Kyiv teaches me what the main, maybe not only for me but for many Kyivans, because I was born in very little town on the western part of Ukraine, Chernivtsi. And when I came to Kyiv, I changed the scale of my thinking from local to all Ukrainian thinking, or even maybe all European thinking. And I change the breadth of communication. In local city, I have maybe 100 people for communication, but in Kyiv, where about 5 million live now, and now I can calculate about maybe 2,000 people. With these people I communicate not every day, but for example during a year, obviously. The next, acceptance of other, it's very important, and to do this with non-aggression, because I could not live in such intensive life and in so scale city if I will be aggressive according to the other people. The next one, dialogueness between people, between religions, between languages, cultures, type of lives, etc., etc. I could like Peter refer to my experience of teacher of university. Kyiv-Mogyla Academy, where I have a very interesting course for my students. This is a practical religious studies. When we visited the different religious temples, universities, managers center, and so on. And we try to know another religion through the representatives of that religion. Not me, like a professor, I teach about this religion, but the representatives of this religion present themselves. And when I compare, for example, the university's ordinary one, state university, or for example, the spiritual seminaries or academy, I could say that the students from the spiritual academy, they have got a huge impressions when they know about another religious traditions, especially they love to visit Jewish center or Islamic one if they are the Greek Catholic or Orthodox one. So the successful of the studying and teaching depends from the persons who involved in this process. And we try to transform Kyiv like a center for very comfortable place for any type of citizens, for those who do not study anything, for those who would like to take more and more knowledge about the space in where they live, or for those who prefer to selectively attitude to this space. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Philippovich, for sharing your thoughts and ideas and concepts. And by this, please let me give the floor to our next speaker. So, Professor Maxim Lepskiy, you're welcome.
Я с таким большим удовольствием заслушался выступлений своих коллег, что понимаю, что надо теперь сформулировать то, что хотелось бы сказать. Но первый момент, который мне хотелось бы отметить, это у профессора Фернандеса в выступлении был концепт палимпсест. И я тоже люблю этот концепт, несмотря на то, что Олег Викторович закрыл глаза руками.
So I listened to all my colleagues with great pleasure, and now I want to say that I have to put my thoughts to you, and I want to say about Professor Fernandez, who used a notion palimpsest. And I also use this notion, even if Dr. Maltsev just closed his eyes right now.
Расскажу одну историю. Мы приехали в Крумлов, и нам рассказывал об истории этого города депутат местного совета.
One time we came to the city named Krumlov, and the history of this city was told us by deputy of this city.
Поскольку этот город входит в наследие ЮНЕСКО,
because this city is one of the cities of UNESCO heritage,
там начали делать реставрационные работы на одном из фасадов здания.
So we saw one building there, and there was a restoration of a facade of this building.
Они сняли первый слой штукатурки и нашли культурный слой XVIII века.
So they removed the one layer of this building, and they found a very old layer from 18th century.
Они сняли второй слой, нашли штукатурку XVII века с не менее интересными изображениями.
And after this, they removed the second layer, and also they found a plaster from the 17th century.
Они так дошли до 15 века.
And they actually were removing layer by layer, and they passed to the 15th century.
В конечном итоге они задали вопрос, до какой степени надо реставрировать эту штукатурку.
And they actually asked, so we have so many layers, so to what extent should we restore this building?
И ответить на этот вопрос они так и не смогли.
And they didn't answer to this question. They still have this question.
Но само здание было одно и то же.
But this is the same building.
И вот когда мы изучали в экспедиционном корпусе, штукатурка и внешние украшения могло быть разным, но здания оставались те же.
And when we were with expeditionary corps in different cities, we saw many situations, many examples when the plaster of the building can be very different. And but at the same time, the building itself is the same always.
И вот я согласен с профессором Ван Петером в вопросе, что есть доминирующий язык символический, который, собственно, отражает смыслы этого города, о чем говорил мой коллега.
And I want to put the thought of Professor Peter Nas, who said that we always have some dominant language of the city, dominant symbolic language, and this symbolic language has a certain meaning.
Но есть и доминирующее понимание сегодняшнего дня, тех символов, которые есть в городе.
But at the same time, we have to understand that we have dominant understanding of modern days, of these symbols that we have in the cities.
Наши студенты тоже делали ментальные карты города.
And our students also did a lot of mental maps of the cities.
У нас, конечно, первыми в этом вопросе был Днепровский национальный университет.
And we talk now about Dnieper National University.
И мы смотрели, как люди презентуют свою историю в местах памяти и как они не презентуют те места, которые связаны с деградацией и разрушением.
And we see the very interesting phenomenon, how people present their city with the places of memory, and at the same time they don't present their cities with a degradation part of the city.
Это говорит о том, что город обучает не только в символике, но и в центрах притяжения и отталкивания.
And we have to point it out that city actually teach people not only in the symbolic part of this city, but also in the center of gravity and at the center of repulsion.
И когда мы начали смотреть современные застройки,
And when we have started researching the modern buildings of the city,
они чаще всего были связаны либо с появлением дополнительной криминальной составляющей,
they very often were connected with a new element, which is criminal one.
если это спальные районы.
When we talk about some kind of sleeping blocks of the city.
И коррупционной составляющей, если это очень красивые, мощные части города, как в Киеве.
And we talk also about the corruption part of the city, corruption element of the city in the very rich and famous and beautiful parts of the city.
Это особенно сложно для нашей страны, поскольку такой сегрегации раньше было значительно меньше.
And this is very confusing for our country because we didn't have such segregation before.
В результате получается символика не только связанная с философской и религиозной, но и символикой социального поведения.
And here we see the phenomenon when symbolics connected not only with religious or philosophical part, but also with sociological part of the city.
И еще не менее значимой динамикой обучения было перемещение от символизма к знаковой системе, которая связана с разметкой, обучением движения слабовидящих.
And also here we see the special dynamics of learning, because on the one side we have symbolic element, and after we come from symbolic element to sign system, it is connected with markup, with it's connected with certain elements of the city for blind people.
До молодежной культуры иконографии, которые очень любят смайлики и другие иконки, которые замещают символическую составляющую.
And also here we talk about the very modern situation when young people use such iconography. We're talking about images right now, which actually replaced the symbolic part. So these images that emojis that young people use, they replace symbolic part that used to be before.
Что означает влияние информационной компьютерной системы, а не городской составляющей.
And here we see the very important impact of the IT sphere and not the city impact.
И, на мой взгляд, это два процесса противостояния реальности городской и символики реальной в городе.
And for me, this situation is such a confrontation between the city symbolism and the reality of the city.
И символизм гиперреальности, который связан с тем черным экраном, который мы сейчас смотрим.
And also we here see the symbolism of hyperreality, and this phenomenon connected with the black screen, which we see here right now in the conference.
Поэтому возникает все больше необходимость обучения культуре города и города как обучающей аудитории.
And here we see that it is very important to teach people the city culture and also to teach them city as a classroom.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lepskiy, for delivering your speech. And by this moment, I'm honored to give the floor to our next speaker, Charles Landry. Please, you're welcome.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave immediately after this because I thought I've got another meeting here in where I am, yeah? And there are lots of people arriving. Anyway, what this just reminds me, this last contribution, is if you look at the former capital of Japan, which was before Tokyo and before Kyoto, it's Nara. And the main temples there are Shinto temples. Now, they claim they are 1,300 years old. And the issue is, symbolically they are. In reality, the wood is changed every 40 years. So what is old and what is new is all really about interpretation. So that's just one point. The second point I want to make is the big question is, who is the learner? Is the city as a whole the learning thing that is teaching you? Or is the individual the learner who's learning from the city? Now, of course, it's interactive, as we well know, because as we know, we shape the city and the city shapes us. Now, I wrote a book, and we've done a thing, the book is called Psychology in the City, which basically developed a method about the urban psyche, which analyzes through a series of questionnaires, it's not perfect, it's all online, what the identity and what a city is. And we've done it in various cities from Berlin to Lisbon and so on, sometimes getting 300, 400, doesn't matter, amount of people to answer the question. Now, of course, a city has multiple identities. And of course, our sort of computer-generated results are not perfect. That doesn't matter. But it generates a conversation about the city where the individual, decision maker, citizen knows one thing: they are an expert in their own city, in a sense of how do they feel about the city. And that leads to discussion, because my work is about, you know, working with cities, about how the city might develop. I just thought that's useful, given that we're using these words. Now, from my perspective, the most interesting form of knowledge, and nobody's saying it's the only form of knowledge, is cultural understanding. I basically believe cultural understanding is the overarching frame within which the other forms of knowledge are more easily understood. But that's just for me. I believe that analysis and the insights and the knowledge that come from that is the thing that I find most useful out of all the forms of knowledge. I don't want to pretend that others are worse or whatever, but I'm just saying that's my perspective. Now, in terms of this thing about who's learning and where's learning, the main thing is obviously the bigger context, and the bigger context of, of course, globalization, etc., and the danger of sameness and homogenization. But even in the processes of homogenization, which is obviously things like, let's say, Hollywood culture or Bollywood culture or any of those cultures riding over the world, or a Korean K-pop or whatever, the individual culture of its origins always shines through. And as we know, and which is effectively expressed here, the city is a complex symbol system. We know that. And the main thing is, how do you decode it? I, in the former speech, said the three methods I use is the notion of cultural resources, I understanding that, the notion of urban literacy, which is a decoding thing, and in my own case, the work I do, which is about having indicators to measure all of that. Now, if we just give a few examples, which I just want to give a very few examples of who's learning, how one learns, or how one interprets places. Because places change all the time, you can easily see that. Let's just take Yangon. It was called Rangoon. When you look at the actual fabric of it, it's got three elements. I'm simplifying. The very old, which is the traditional Burmese, the British influence, which is colonial, and the new influence, which is essentially Chinese investment, yeah? And they all have a different flavor. The old is being torn down, of course. We don't want that because we're a modern place. So the image, self-image is that we are modern, and that's not the image of all the inhabitants, of course. It's of the decision makers who are trying to make an impact. The British heritage is being left because it's too expensive to do anything. If they were cleverer, those buildings they would keep and do up well, because that would be precisely the thing that attracts investments that they need. The shopping centres and everything else they're building is completely boring, and you can see it everywhere in the world. If you take another city, Kolkata, yeah? Kolkata, of course, changes its name, Calcutta to Kolkata. So that's all very symbolic. That was the intellectual capital of India, as you know. And, you know, Rabindranath Tagore was one of the main features, incredibly internationally oriented. He is now called Thakur, so another name change. So you're getting the name changing, which is basically going back to the historic identities. However, the resonance and the power of Kolkata has reduced dramatically in the last 60 years because the power has gone to Mumbai and Delhi. So what is the message that you see in the city? And there are various elements, by the way, the Botanical Gardens and the Indian Museum, which are both classically European things to have been inserted, ironically were founded by a long way back relative of my wife. So I have quite a strong link to Calcutta and know it relatively deeply. But what is the message of the city to its citizens, to the outside world? Its decline and sadness. Mumbai has another message, entrepreneurialism and energy, but in fact it's a very corrupt place, as you know. It's corrupt. The slums, Dharavi, one of the biggest slums, which is incredibly complex and interesting inside, vast skills and knowledge coming from all over India of those migrants coming in, things like that, you know, being torn down because they're speculators. And then you've got the Bollywood experience. So that is the culture that they are ultimately projecting. Whatever the massive elements of the culture that they brought into the play, that have been brought into the place by these millions of migrants. So in a sense, Mumbai in its own way is very disappointing in terms of a message. If you then take Siena, and I'm aware of the 7 minutes, let's just leave it as Siena rather than going to others, is Siena, when you go to the Piazza del Campo, what you see there is the classic message, which is the message, and our friend Fernandez obviously knows this, where the different powers are agglomerated in a place. You have there now economic power, the market. You have civic power, one of the buildings on the left. You have the museum now, which let's call it learning power. And obviously, historically, you had the very wealthy, which is that connection power. And the Fonte Gaia, which is where the water came from, which is in a sense the energy. So that is the classic. That's why everybody talks about Siena. That's the classic thing where powers come together, and you can see it all in one. These things today in modern cities are all often increasingly fragmented. You know, the civic power goes to the edge of town or something, etc., etc. Perhaps just finally a couple of words about Dubai. Dubai, of course, is a reinvented city. It was a pearling place, trading place, etc., a bit of an oil place. Oil ran out, and so it looked for a new role. Back to the question of civilizations, we know that's a difficult concept, so but broadly, there's an Arab civilization in very broad terms. And when you look at civilizations, in quotes, every civilizational center needs a hub. Like Moscow is probably the hub of the Slavic zone. And when Beirut collapsed, and it was the hub, the trading hub of that region in its connections to the outside world because of its internationalism, the French and all of those influences, Dubai was very clever in claiming that hub status. That in turn has changed the story and its self-identification of its own story, of its own citizens and of the outside world. But remember, Dubai is not a real Dubai because only 14% of the population are Emirati. So I'll just leave you with that thought. Yeah, goodbye from me as well. Sorry about that, but I've really got lots of people here who are in a meeting waiting. So thanks for everything and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you for your participation. But actually the conference is not over yet because we've got one more honorable speaker. And right now, please let me give the floor to Professor Vitali Lunov. So let's continue the discussion.
Если говорить о факторной нагрузке и о том, что связано с обучением в разных цивилизациях, в разных культурах, мы понимаем, что разные эпохи требовали разного от жизнеспособности города и государства. И, естественно, одним из наиболее таких ярких стилей воспитания и обучения это был Рим. Древний Рим, когда главной целью и главной задачей было обучение в пользу государства, вот что есть принципиально важным.
Talking about some kind of factor loading, we talk about training, about teaching, and of course we have to point it out that different type of civilization and different type of cultures, they had different type of teaching. And when we talk about ages, one by one, we see that all this teaching was affected by different types of vitality of the city. And first city which we have to remember is the Rome, because the city Rome, we speak about ancient times, has very interesting type of teaching for the government and for the people who were in power.
И, собственно, большинство таких традиций я бы разделил на два типа городов, если очень обобщенно сказать о древности и о символизме в этом случае. Это город-государство или город-убежище.
And talking about this type of old traditions, I want to divide all cities on two types, talking about symbolism. So the first type is the city/state, and the second type is the city kind of refuge.
Вот, отталкиваясь от этих двух типов, город-государство или город-убежище, от этого и, собственно, была традиция обучения, подготовки горожан.
And when we have these two types of cities, one is the city as a state, and the second one, the city is refuge, we have two types of traditions of teaching in these cities.
Если говорить о сегодняшнем времени, то мы видим эпоху глобализации, правда, которая сейчас немного угомонилась в связи с карантинными мерами. Видим эпоху унификации всех систем, которые есть. И это, естественно, накладывает отпечаток на то, является ли современный город в настоящее время такой учебной аудиторией для большинства горожан.
And talking about modern times, we see, of course, globalization, but of course, last situation with coronavirus make it a little bit lower. And when we talk about globalization, and the second thing what we see, it is unification. And of course, globalization and unification affects to the city and affects to the types of teaching and certain view on the city as a classroom.
Мы начали, собственно, точнее уже, скажем, заканчиваем исследования проводить сейчас по модели теста Роршаха на изучение городского пространства. И спасибо, очень многие приняли в нем участие. Это базируется на наших идеях с Олегом Викторовичем в момент, когда мы изучали Юкатан в 2019 году, Мексика.
And actually right now we are coming to the last step of our researching work, which dedicated to the certain approach of the test of Rorschach. And this test researching the space, the environment of the city. And all of this actually the consequences of certain ideas which we had with Dr. Maltsev in our expedition in Yucatan in Mexico.
Если говорить об очень предварительных таких результатах, что меня сейчас удивляет, это то, что около трети опрошенных считают, что город не является учебной аудиторией, но при этом описывают социальные институты, которые являются учебными аудиториями этого города.
And there is very interesting fact. We made some kind of many interviews of the people, how they perceive the city. And preliminary results told us that all people, not all, but majority of the people, they think that city is not as a classroom, actually. But at the same time, they see many different social institutes of the city that can teach people. And this is very interesting because they think that social institutes can teach and city itself cannot teach.
Есть очень много таких интересных и противоречивых результатов, но мы уже позже, после конференции их презентуем. Собственно, я бы в завершении сказал таких пару тезисов. Это то, что город в настоящее время может утратить себя как учебную аудиторию, поскольку с ним всегда воюет государственная власть. Вот город символьный, сильный, самодостаточный, он как бы часто претендует на противопоставление себя массовке, которая государству гораздо удобнее, чем города-государства, которые в нем могут быть. Особенно это видно сейчас в нашей стране.
And here I want to say something very contradictory, that we have very contradictory results of this research, but of course the results of this research will be after conference. And I want to say some thesis about the city right now, that all cities actually right now lose their ability to be a city as a classroom. And the reason of this is government, because government doesn't want to see city as really strong, and government opposes itself to the city, and they prefer to see the state but not the city as a state.
И у нас это усложняется тем, что столица Киев у нас это не конечная точка государствостроения. Так на протяжении последних столетий есть, и поэтому самобытность городов в этом случае находится под некоторой угрозой. Спасибо.
And here's one more complicated thing, because Kiev, this is not the last point of such state structure, if we can say so. And at the same time, we see that identity of the different cities in our country, they lose their identity. And this is very not good for the city as a classroom element. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, dear speakers, dear colleagues, professors, academicians. Thank you for sharing your concepts, your ideas, your views. So by this moment, I believe it's high time we finished our panel discussion dedicated to symbolism, mysticism, visual sociology of the European continent. And by this, again, let me thank you once again. Overall, I should say that soon after the conference, issues like papers and videos, they'll be published on the website, as well as a special brochure will be released a little bit later. And by this, again, the conference, today's discussion panel is over. Thank you so much for your participation. See you soon. See you tomorrow. Goodbye and have a nice time.
Yeah.